The Harappan civilization, the civilization of the Indus Valley. What this is showing is that the Indus civilization, and probably many of you have never heard of the Indus or the Harappa, didn't learn about it in grade school, right? It was a civilization as large as Mesopotamia and Egypt, existing at the same time as Mesopotamia and Egypt, right? So this is really a third great civilization in this general region. Okay, we're going to look first at it's kind of the environmental background of the Indus, what's also known as Harappan civilization because of one of the key sites of this civilization, Harappa. We're talking about the Indus River Valley, which is here. You can see it's on the border. Well, it covers the borders of India and Pakistan. All right, so here's the border. You can see here. Here's the Indus. All right, so it's this low, flat, alluvial floodplain, a little bit like Mesopotamia. Right, as you've got these river systems feeding into the Indus, right, emptying out here into the Indian Ocean, and just like in Mesopotamia and Egypt, what this provided people with was great fertile land for agriculture, and also transportation links between different regions of the Indus. Right? So a very efficient way, as we said, of transporting goods, of communication. What they didn't have a lot of was stone and metals and things like that. Just like in Mesopotamia, these things were in the mountains. And so they traded for these things. As we're going to see, there was a lot of production of goods, craft goods, and trade of these craft goods in between different sites in the Indus. Right? The Indus, right, this region here, had one fairly uniform culture. And this culture, right, is the largest ancient civilization in terms of geography. We're, 1.25 million square kilometers. So bigger, the Mesopotamian civilization was here, Egyptian civilization along there, but the Indus was the largest in terms of geographical square area. And a lot of that had to do, again, because of the river. The river allowed people to communicate with each other, to trade goods, right? Villages were connected to cities, etc., etc. Right? So here you kind of get an idea, the different tributaries feeding into the Indus. And during the height of the Indus civilization, as we'll see, there was trade between the Indus civilization and Mesopotamia, right? Using the Persian Gulf and the Indian Ocean. All right, these are some of the main sites. We'll be talking about Harappa and Mohenjo-Daro mainly, but there are other sites as well. This is a very urban civilization, right? Very large cities, as we're going to see. This is the northern region in the mountains outside of the Indus River Valley. Right? It gives you a little bit idea of the terrain, right? This is where you get a lot of those, those stones like lapis lazuli, that were important in the Indus and also Mesopotamia as well. Okay, this gives you a little bit of a, more of an idea of some of the geographical layout. The very earliest, sites were all on tributaries, right? And some of these tributaries are no longer there, but we can see from the locations of the sites where they used to be. Okay. And again, this kind of gives you an idea, where the sites are located concentrated along the rivers. You don't see the sites spread uniformly all over, right? They're really concentrated along rivers, which were good for agriculture and good for transportation. Right? And even today, as we said, the best way to transport goods is with boat, right? And it still is that way in this region of the world. Here you can kind of see the Indus River area, right? So we're talking about a flat floodplain. Sometimes the rivers would flood these sites, but again, an efficient way of transporting goods. Here you can see some boats on the Indus today, even transporting camels on the Indus this way. The Indus also domesticated some animals independently of other areas, right? That is, there were certain animals that were first domesticated in the Indus and then spread to other areas, and that are really unique to the Indus. And one of these animals is the zebu, which you can see here, the water buffalo. Eventually is found in Mesopotamia, but it originates in the Indus, right? So we could see kind of independent invention of agriculture here. Agriculture you have by 6000 BC in the Indus, and then by a few hundred years later, it spreads all over the Indus Valley, and you get some very early Neolithic villages in the Indus, which are a lot like the early agricultural villages in the Middle East, right? We're talking about mud houses, with mud walls, about a few hundred people in each of these villages. Right? It gives you, again, a little bit of an idea of some of these very early villages. Right? These kind of similar planned houses, right? And during the Harappan phase, what you start to see, so around, even in the in this period, but then more into the third millennium, so 3300 BC, you start to see a regional culture, right? What this means is that the pottery, the architecture, the religion of this region is very, very similar to each other. It's really one culture. It's not that different areas of the Indus are going off in different directions. It's the communication and the trade and the contact between all of these areas in the Indus is allowing the entire area to evolve together as a regional culture. And so what archaeologists see is similar artifacts all over the Indus. They don't really see big differences between, let's say, the northern Indus versus the southern Indus. A lot of them have fertility figures like you can see here. This is a male horned fertility figure that we'll talk about. And this is the kind of pottery that's found there. So you start to see a regional culture, uniform pottery, uniform architecture all over the region because of this trade and contact. And you have the beginnings of trade goods that are being traded among these different areas. So you can see these are bangles, right? These kind of bracelets. They're made out of shell and also made out of clay. And we'll talk about how important they are in Harappan civilization. And this is a seal that was used to stamp in clay, just like the cylinder seals in Mesopotamia. Okay, so about 2800 BC to about 1700 BC is the height of Harappan civilization. And so the populations get larger and larger and larger. The region as a whole is emerging together. Right? And we're going to kind of look at the height of Harappan civilization from some of the major cities. Right? Okay. In these areas, because of the tributaries, again, there were lots of connections and links, trade links between villages, towns, cities, right? There was a lot of integration between these different regions. All right, so let's first look at Mohenjo-Daro, one of the most famous sites of the Indus civilization. This is just showing one part of Mohenjo-Daro. Mohenjo-Daro is a huge city. This is the main part, or this is the central part of the city, sometimes called the citadel. We're going to look at some of the buildings in Mohenjo-Daro and also Harappa and kind of see what archaeologists can tell about the Harappan civilization from looking at these cities. Harappa is comprised of mounds, different mounds that were encircled by walls. We'll sort of take a look at. You have evidence of trade, not just with goods moving, but also you have depictions of boats, models of boats, carts, right, that show that goods were moving around. Also, take a look at this. These look like dice. They're not dice because they're not marked, but what they actually are, believe it or not, are standardized weights. Right? These different size stones, these cubes, are standardized weights that are actually found all over. All over the Indus River Valley. Right? And when you think about that, the entire region, 1.25 million square kilometers, was using the same system of weights. It shows that there's some kind of organization here in this civilization. Some group is organizing the weights and the measures in this civilization. You also have, we talked about the undeciphered writing in Harappa. It's found all over the Indus. Right? So again, another form of the regional culture, of the similarities between these groups. And the writing is found on seals. So this is a stone seal that was used to stamp into clay. These are some clay seals here. And you can see this animal has one horn. You might think, okay, it has one horn because it's the side view and you can only see one horn. But there are also these figurines of these one-horned animals, unicorns, right? So it shows unicorns were real. No, it shows that this was some special animal because it appears on a lot of these different seals, and also appears in other artistic representations as well. So again, showing the region growing up together. Here's some more examples of the undeciphered Indus script, and what you can see are different characters. This has not been deciphered yet, so we don't know exactly what these are saying, but it looks like a language. This piece is interesting, right? Archaeologists sometimes can tell interesting things from the most basic things that they find. It's a piece of clay, sealed, right, with 4 different seals on it, right? 4 different unicorn seals. And, you might think, okay, well, what's the significance there? It would be like having a form that, you had to get the department chair to sign, and then you had to get the dean to sign, and then you had to get the provost to sign, and then you had to get, let's say, the president to sign in order for something to happen. We're talking about bureaucracy. We're talking about organization, right, where 4 different people are stamping the same object, right? It's showing that there are 4 different individuals, maybe 4 different groups, 4 different representations involved in what's going on here. So that implies that this is a very complex society, a very organized society. Here's another seal. Take a guess what these are. If you guessed numbers, you're probably right. Again, we don't know, but this seems likely that this is some sort of tally or numbers. Okay, so this is kind of looking for one of the neighborhoods at that main part of Mohenjo-Daro. These are some of the mounds of Harappa. When you look at both sites, again, you can see here's Mohenjo-Daro with the ancient streets, and here's Harappa with mounds and walls around each mound. And this is kind of looking at them side by side over here. All right, these are the ancient streets of Mohenjo-Daro. Right, when you look at the streets, you'll see that a lot of the main streets are laid out in a grid pattern. Right? And this is pretty incredible when you think about an ancient society. What this shows, again, is that there's organization. These streets had to be laid out first before the buildings were constructed. There had to be a plan, right, to the city before the city was built. And you could kind of see a little bit more of the organization there of Mohenjo-Daro. Even the residential quarters were fairly organized. And here's this really wide avenue. We'll see another depiction of it. You can see some of the streets on either side of the avenue are roughly the same, same place. Right? So again, that implies organization. And when you take a look at some of these streets, so this is a really wide street. Why was it so wide? Well, probably because there were so many people using this broad avenue. But when you look at the street, you'll notice here this line running there, right? What this is a sewer. Sanitation works, right? It turns out, we'll see some more depictions of this. It turns out that Mohenjo-Daro and Harappa, there were complex sewage public sanitation works. Right? So again, that implies organization. You can only have a sewer system in the city if someone is planning it all over the city. You cannot have it kind of emerging slowly neighborhood to neighborhood. It has to be organized all from the top. When you look at a city like Boston, this is Boston, you compare it to a city like New York, I mean, this is Manhattan. Right, you can see that Boston doesn't look very organized in many sections, and it's not. The streets were not laid out at one period. The city grew up slowly over time. Roads were built to connect growing parts of the city. Right, whereas in Manhattan, when the British took over New Amsterdam and made it New York, and this was New Amsterdam, they laid out this grid pattern all at once, even before they started to really settle the rest of Manhattan Island. And so you can see a real organization there. It's the same thing with Mohenjo-Daro. You see an organizational pattern there that suggests that people at the top are making important decisions. All right, this is Harappa, and we're talking about these cities now all together. I'm not going to ask you to know differences between the cities, right? We're just going to kind of talk about them all together as Harappan cities, or cities of the Indus River Valley. But the walls around the different mounds. Some might think protection, right? Walls are for protection. But if that was the case, you would imagine that there would be one major wall around the entire city, not walls around different mounds. Most likely what's going on here is not protection, but these are kind of walled off areas of the city, and the walls are used to control access in and out of the city. Right? And so they're sort of controlling who can come in to certain sections, who can go out of certain sections. And here at Harappa, you see some of the major sewage and drains within the city. Okay, just to give you a little sense of size, this is from one of the areas of the city, and there's that citadel that we were talking about all the way in the distance. This is both of these cities are very, very large cities. Here you can see densely packed houses together. But this was a real urban center. Right here you can see that citadel again. It was not a citadel in the sense that we think of a citadel. It's just called a citadel by the archaeologists. It was not a fortification or a castle. It was actually something very different and we're going to see. This is again the center of that citadel. Okay, here's that main avenue that we were looking at before, right? Huge, wide avenue, probably because of all the people moving back and forth, bringing goods to market, etc. Here you could kind of see one of the alleyways behind some of these houses and covered sewage drains. Again, that way you didn't actually have to smell some of the sewage that as it was leaving people's houses and being shunted outside the city. Right? So this was very important for the public good. Right? When you think about London in the 1840s, 1850s, there was a huge cholera outbreak in London because one of the sewage systems had broken and was leaking into the drinking water supply. Right? And it became a huge public health nightmare. Right? And here we see 2600 BC, over 4,000 years ago, public sanitation in an ancient civilization. It's kind of amazing. Right? There were also wells. So the leaders of Harappa and Mohenjo-Daro were providing or making sure that there were drinking water. There was drinking water in different neighborhoods. So this is a neighborhood well that you can see here. And this gives you a little bit of an idea of what a house would have looked like in one of these cities. Open courtyard to allow for good circulation of air. Right? Each house had a washing room, basically a room where you could wash yourself, where the water would lead out into a covered drain. Right? So you could bring home fresh water from the well. You could drink from it. You can bathe in it. Right? Keep yourself clean, and the waste, do your business in the house, and the waste would be shunted out of the city. So pretty amazing. Here you can see some more of those canals that were linked up, and one of the wells. Here's one of the covered drainages, right? And a drain in Harappa as well. Another well in Harappa. Okay, within the center of Mohenjo-Daro, in what's called the Citadel, wasn't really a citadel, are a couple of important public buildings. One of the most famous is what's known as the Great Bath. This is a sunken enclosure, you can see here, that was waterproofed. So it looks like this was some sort of public bath, right? You're not going to build something that holds water above ground. You're going to sink it into the ground for stability, and it was also waterproofed, and you could see the steps leading down. This is another kind of view of the bath, right? And here you can see it there, right? And another view. This is what it might have looked like when the buildings were around it. When you look at Indian culture today, and you look at how during certain festivals people go to the Ganges and immerse themselves and bathe ritually in the Ganges, this bath was most likely for ritual purposes. Right? It was most likely a ceremonial area where people would bathe themselves ritually and become ritually clean. So think of baptism, right? That's another version of purification through ritual bathing. Right? This is probably what this was used for. Next to the Great Bath is a building which there was a building on top of a large foundation, and the foundation had these holes, you can see here, these shafts, which are pretty small. No one could fit in any of these shafts. They think that these shafts might have been used for air circulation, right? And that the air would have circulated beneath this building, which would have held grain. So this might have been a huge storage granary for surplus food, which would be used to pay craft specialists and things like that. And the air circulating beneath it prevented the grain from getting moldy and stuff like this. This is also called a granary. It's in Harappa, but there's some debate as to whether it was a granary or not. Even the one in Mohenjo-Daro, people debate whether it was a granary or not. But either way, it was an important public building. Okay, here you can see again more of the complex organization that went into the sewage system and the Great Bath. Right? And there was a area of water to maintain the levels here in the Great Bath. Okay, one of the other hallmarks of Harappan civilization was crafts. Right? Craft specialization was a very important part of Harappan Indus civilization, and many different kinds of crafts were produced and traded all over the Indus and between the Indus and other areas. Right? So you can see some of the crafts here. Woodworking. We're going to focus on bangles, and we're also going to talk a little bit about some of the bead making, right, that went on in these cities. All right, a lot of the trading areas were probably right near the city gates. You could kind of imagine merchants meeting in the city, using standardized weights, like you can see here, to trade for different things like lapis, other semi-precious stones, right, and conducting business in one of these cities. In Harappa, they've excavated crafts quarters, right? So the quarters of the craft specialists that show, basically, they have debris from where they were making certain things, the leftovers, the junk, that kind of thing, that's produced when you're making a craft. Okay, so here you can see some of the crafts quarters that they found. kilns that were used to bake clay, etc., etc. Right? Some of the crafts, again, were pretty simple. Flint knives, chert knives, everyone needs one to butcher their meat, harvest their wheat, etc. That's sort of a utilitarian item. Other goods took a lot more work, were a little bit more of a luxury item. One of the most important pieces of jewelry in the Harappan world were bangles. And the more elite, or the richer citizens of Harappa would have bangles made out of shell. This is a shell that's been, you can see, cut or sliced into sections, and this forms these bracelets or bangles. Right? These are bangles that are made out of clay, but that are fired in such a way in a kiln that they simulate stone, right? So they look and feel like stone. These are some of the beads that were produced, all by hand, from rough raw material like this. So you can see the work that went into taking something like this and turning it into something like this, right? That's a huge amount of work, right? Some of these carnelian beads that you can see here were found, right? Identical ones found in Mesopotamia, including the royal tomb of Ur, right? And this is one of the pieces of evidence that there was trade between Mesopotamia and the Indus in some of these beads, right? Well, how did they, make these bangles and these stone beads, right? It was a complicated process, and they've been able to figure out how beads were made based on the way they make beads in the same area today, and they could kind of see, observing people today, how these beads were made. They would start with the rough stone, they would heat it, they would chip it down, heat it again, chip it down, grind it, polish it, drill a hole through the center, and then heat it again to bring out the color. So again, all of this was done by hand. Each bead, took a good deal of work. This is how they would take those clay bangles and fire them in a special kiln to make them appear as if they were stone. And these bangles are found everywhere. It looks like citizens all over the Indus had bangles. So there was probably an important symbolic piece of jewelry, almost like a wedding band is, right? When you see someone with a wedding band on their left hand, on the ring finger, right, that indicates that they're married. So these bangles must have also indicated something too, but we don't know exactly what they did indicate. But again, a very important piece of Harappan culture. What you see in the Indus is that wealth is found not only in the cities and in different areas of the cities, but you also have trade goods like these found in the villages as well. So even in these smaller sites, because of the rivers and because of the way Harappan culture worked, other people had access to these luxury items as well. And this is a cache that was found in a house underneath a floor, and this was probably maybe a secure area where a woman kept her jewelry, you can see here. And a lot of it, again, shows high level of artistic skill. This is the director of the Harappan excavations showing how a bronze drill would be used to make a hole in one of these beads. So again, very detailed work. Other things that were made, right? Bronze implements you can see, so some kind of knife, chisel, spears, fish hooks, right? Other kinds of tools, mirror that you can see here, and also pottery. The pottery is uniform throughout the Indus area. I mean, that is, it has a very similar style throughout the whole Indus area. This kind of looks like a tandoor cover that you might see in India today. Okay, so one of the pieces of trade, evidence of trade between the Indus and Mesopotamia are these beads. Right? There are other pieces of evidence, right? Such as a cylinder seal in Mesopotamia that mentions that the owner of this seal is from a place called Meluha. Meluha is probably the name for the ancient Indus civilization. So this was someone from the Indus who moved to Mesopotamia to conduct business, And this is his cylinder seal while he was in Mesopotamia. In the Persian Gulf, you also find seals with different animals, such as elephants, which, the elephants are depicting Indian, South Asian elephants. So again, showing trade and communication between the Indus, the Gulf, and Mesopotamia. Okay, here's another piece of, and these are some of the carnelian beads from Mesopotamia that were probably made in the Indus. Here are some seals. You can see here what they found. This object over here is interesting because it's one clay object. On one side is a Indus-looking seal with an elephant. On the other side is this other seal that comes from another area, comes from Central Asia. And so to have one object, two different seals on this object from two different regions, what was it? Some people think it might have functioned like a passport, that you've got an agreement between two different regions on the same object. A passport is an object that we carry that could have stamps from different regions on it. The burials in Harappa. There are burials with wealth in them, but we don't see very, very elaborate burials like we see with the royal tombs of Ur or the tomb of Tutankhamun. Right? These are the kinds of burials that are found in the Harappan civilization. You can see this is a woman laid out with pots, and also a young child here. Maybe she died in childbirth under her leg. Okay, what about the religion of the people of ancient Harappa? Well, there's only a little bit of information, but from the information that we have, it looks like the religion was partly based on fertility. Right? These are some female figurines. We said that female figurines could indicate fertility. Another interesting thing about this female figurine is you can see the hand upraised there in front of the face. The other hand, it's broken, but it would have been upraised in the same way. And when you think about, the hands pressed together, palms together in front of someone's face, that's something that you see in India today, right? It's a prayer stance. It's also a stance of greeting or a demonstration of greeting. So here we have a connection of modern India to ancient India. Another connection of some of the religious attributes of ancient Indus to modern India. This is a male deity with horns, important figure in the Harappan culture. And what you see is this person is seated, hands on the knees, right? Legs are bent, and the feet are facing each other, are together near the groin, right? So legs going like that, as you can see. This is essentially the lotus position. And the lotus position comes from yoga, and yoga comes from India, right? And then yoga spreads to other areas, right? And so yoga, which was an important part of Indian culture and religion, may go all the way back to the ancient Indus, right? So again, here we see that horned deity sitting in what looks like the lotus position. There are also figures of animals at outdoor shrines and depictions of what look like religious rituals occurring outdoors. Right, so here you can see animals eating at a trough. And this is another depiction of that male horned deity. Right? We said that bowls and things like that, bowls usually symbolize male fertility. Some of the female figurines could symbolize female fertility. That's some of the interpretations of what might be going on here. You could see some other female figurines. Right? And again, you see the bangles on the arms here, indicating that these were probably important symbolic pieces of jewelry. This is a clay depiction of an elephant. And here we can see more of those unicorn seals, right? So you'll notice when you look at these unicorn seals and you look at the characters up here, these are all different seals, all with the unicorn. This is the zebu, the water buffalo, and here's a rhinoceros. Right? Now, the fact that you see stamps with the same animals on them, right? So different seals, same animal, right? That might indicate something. It might indicate that the people who use these seals are a member of a group. What kind of group? A king group? A tribe? A craft group? A class? We don't exactly know, but it may be that these different seals and the animals on them represent the different groups within the Indus Civilization. Okay, here's another seal where you can see some of these characters for of the Harappan language. So far, they found 3,500 different examples of Indus script. But again, they have not been able to translate it because there's nothing like a Rosetta Stone that exists in the ancient Egyptian civilization. Okay, what I'd like you to do for Monday, and what we'll talk about Monday morning, is think about how the Indus compares to Egypt and Mesopotamia. That is, so far, we mentioned a whole host of things that exist in Harappa and Mohenjo-Daro. But what things don't you see in Mohenjo-Daro and Harappa in the Indus civilization that did exist in Mesopotamia and that did exist in Egypt? How are these civilizations different? Right? And that's where we'll pick it up on Monday and talk about that.